name's Dr. Jeremy Ray, and today we're going to talk about the brainstem. So to begin with, we need to review the major regions of the human brain. So here in a sagittal cross-section is an adult human brain. At the top we have the cerebral hemispheres, which is where all your higher order brain functions take place, so it's conscious thought and so forth. And as we move progressively down the brain, we encounter regions that are responsible for more, if you like, primitive functions in the body. So we move down now to this region called the diencephalon, and this contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which are responsible for homeostasis in the body. Over here we have the cerebellum, which is responsible for coordinating fine muscle movement in the body. And lastly, the subject of today's talk, the brainstem, which is the most posterior part of the brain and is continuous with the spinal cord. So here we have a more detailed view of the brainstem. And whenever I see this, it actually reminds me a bit of the chestburster creature from the Alien films. So if you've ever seen those, you'll know what I mean. However, that aside, we have the three major components which we're going to talk about today. So the most superior portion is the midbrain. Underneath that are the pons. And lastly, we have the medulla oblongata, which is normally abbreviated to medulla. So we're going to talk about each of these in detail in terms of structure and function and their role in the human nervous system. Another important point to make is that the diencephalon, shown here, which remember is composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and you can also see the pituitary gland here. Depending on which source you use, certain textbooks and internet sources, sometimes the diencephalon is included as part of the brainstem, but most of the time it isn't. So we're going to discuss that in more detail another time, but today we're going to focus on these three components. So just to review the diencephalon very briefly, because it is discussed in more detail elsewhere, but as noted, sometimes it is included when we talk about the brainstem, but most of the time it isn't. So the uppermost part is the thalamus, which is the final relay and processing point for ascending sensory information and also contains a number of specialized nuclei. Underneath that is the hypothalamus. So that is the main visceral control center of the body and essential for maintaining homeostatic balance, autonomic functions, and exerts most of its effects for the pituitary gland, shown here, via hormone production. So it's fair to say that overall the brainstem controls the more primitive functions in our brain, which are essential for life. So it controls involuntary visual and auditory reflexes, controls eye movements, and regulation of essential involuntary functions such as breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion. So we're going to start by talking about the midbrain, which is the most superior portion of the brainstem. So again, here we have the diencephalon, so it is inferior to the diencephalon up here. Here's the midbrain, here are the pons, and here's the medulla oblongata. So a distinguishing feature of the midbrain are these large tracts. So just to revise our terminology, so remember grey and white matter. So what is the difference between them? Well, grey matter are cell bodies or nuclei, and white matter are nerve axons, also known as tracts. So what we see are these large tracts, also known as corticospinal tracts, which are descending down towards the spinal cord. They are also called cerebral punducles. So punducles means that these tracts do not cross over or intermingle. And their role is to conduct motor impulses from the cerebral cortex, and remember the cerebral cortex contains the motor center of the brain, to carry these signals downwards to the pons and to the spinal cord. And in addition, the midbrain conducts sensory impulses upwards from the spinal cord towards the thalamus. Okay, so we're going to continue talking about the midbrain. here we have a dorsal view, and we're going to talk about these structures here, which collectively are known as the corpora quadgemina of Tectum. Sure hope I pronounced that right. Okay, so we'll start off talking about these bodies here, known as the superior colliculi. So they are reflex centers for movements of the eyes, head and neck in response to visual stimuli. And these bodies underneath, in response to auditory stimuli, are reflex centers where you get movement of the head and trunk. We have these major nerves, so there is control exerted by the midbrain over the oculomotor and trochlear cranial nerves, which are responsible for eye movement. And lastly, we have the substantia nigra. So what these are darkly pigmented cells, nuclei that are believed to control subconscious muscle activity. So moving down the brainstem, we have now come to the pons. So the pons are found between the midbrain and the medulla. And the name pons is actually Latin for bridge, which makes sense when we look at the function of the pons. So they contain these distinctive horizontal fibers or conduction tracts, and their role is to carry nerve impulses from the higher brain centers and the spinal cord, and also between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. So remember, the cerebellum is responsible for fine muscle movement, coordination of fine muscle movement. There are several nuclei of origin for cranial nerves, numbers 5 to 8. So that includes the trigeminal, abducens, and facial nerves. We now come to the medulla, which is the most inferior part of the brainstem, connecting the brain to the spinal cord. And it has these distinctive features called pyramids, and where they cross over called the decussation of the pyramids, as shown here. So this crossover point allows for what's known as contralateral control of voluntary movement. So contralateral is when one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. It also contains a series of relay stations and reflex centers. So continuing on with the medulla, which is shown here in cross-section, we have something called the reticular formation. So the reticular formation is actually found throughout the brainstem, so it's also in the pons and midbrain, and it has a role in consciousness and arousal. Medulla contains a number of vital centers, so controlling essential body functions such as heartbeat and breathing, blood vessel diameter, which is important for blood pressure, and a number of other centers for reflex actions such as swallowing, vomiting, coughing, and sneezing, and so forth. It also is the origin of nuclei for a number of cranial nerves, specifically 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So at this point, using what we've learned, we can start thinking about some clinical applications. So knowing now what the brainstem does, and in particular the medulla, can you predict the results of injury to these areas? So maybe think about that for a minute or two. As you might expect, a hard enough blow to the back of the head or upper neck where the medulla is located can be potentially fatal. And in particular, damage to the respiratory center is particularly concerning and can result in death. There are a range of non-fatal injuries as well to the medulla, and these could include, for example, cranial nerve malfunction. So recall there are several cranial nerves that originate in the medulla. There may be paralysis or loss of sensation on the opposite side of the body, and remember that is due to the decussation of the pyramids and contralateral control, meaning that damage on one side of the brain will result in the lost sensation on the opposite side of the body. And because of the various vital centers that are located in the medulla, then you may see irregularities in breathing or heart rhythm as a result. So in review, remember that the brainstem consists of three major components: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, also known as the medulla. The brainstem contains centers for essential unconscious functions and various reflex actions. The midbrain relays motor impulses from the cerebral cortex to the pons and sensory impulses from the spinal cord to the thalamus. The superior colliculi coordinate movement of the eyeballs in response to visual and other stimuli, and the inferior colliculi coordinate movements of the head and trunk in response to auditory stimuli. The substantia nigra contributes to the control of movement, and it's the origin of cranial nerves 3 and 4. The pons relay impulses from one side of the cerebellum to the other and between the medulla and midbrain. They contain a nuclei of origin for the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. They also contain centers that are important for breathing. The medulla oblongata relays motor and sensory impulses between other parts of the brain and the spinal cord. It contains the reticular formation, which is also in the pons and the midbrain and in the diencephalon, and functions in consciousness and arousal. It has the vital centers, which are essential for the control of heartbeat, breathing, blood vessel diameter, and other centers that are important for reflexes such as swallowing, sneezing, and coughing, so forth. It is the origin of nuclei for cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. You may find this version of the summary slide useful for your revision. Here is an interesting article I found in Nature regarding reticular formation and spinal cord injury.